Hi, everybody. It's great to have you all here, and thanks for your flexibility. We had to make some changes today, so we're very appreciative that you're all with us. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., I warmly welcome you to tonight's America at a Crossroads virtual town hall program. I think it's our 87th program, 87 consecutive weeks. Our judge leadership team includes former Congressman Mel Levine, David Lehr, former LA County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky, Caroline Kelly, and Rabbi Ken Chazin. And you saw the list of our co-sponsors on the screen a moment ago, and we thank them all. We want to express our special gratitude to Bill Kristol. This morning, when we received word that Governor Whitmer would not be joining us tonight, our leadership team immediately began brainstorming what to do. We all agreed that Bill Kristol, a most beloved and brilliant thinker, and America at a Crossroads former guest, just might be menschy enough to make himself available for our audience on short notice, and we were right. Many, many thanks to Bill for agreeing to change his calendar and become available to us to ensure that we can continue to be informed and inspired to fight for our democracy. And a second special thank you to Madeleine Brand, who I'm sure spent a lot of time meticulously preparing to moderate a conversation with Governor Whitmer, and who was willing on a dime to adjust. We truly are blessed with both Bill Kristol and Madeleine Brand, and are so pleased that we did not have to cancel tonight's town hall program. We have some amazing programs coming up. Next week, we will focus on America's youngest voters. We will look at generational changes and voting trends and efforts afoot by some to suppress the votes of young voters. We will welcome three experts in the field: activist and attorney Yael Bromberg, who specializes in litigation related to youth voter suppression, and political scientist Mike Hayes and Morley Winograd, who are co-authors of 3 books on generational change and its impact on politics. It'll be a fascinating and important program. We will not be having a program on December 29th, but we will be back with a vengeance on January 5th with a very special set of guests who will help us gain perspective as we mark the first anniversary of the January 6th insurrection. Joanna Mendelsohn from ADL Center on Extremism, Imran Ahmed from the Center for Digital Hate, and Carol Leoning from the Washington Post, who will discuss 1 year later, our capital, our country, our democracy. Where are we? And Larry Mantle will be our moderator. As we prepare to close out another year of digital programming, we want to thank our audience. Thank you for being here each week. Thank you for your intelligence and for your donations, and also for your notes. We really value them. Full unedited recordings of all of our programs can be found on our YouTube channel and on our website. An easy to use link is provided in every email David or I send. And I just want to comment that you should not advertently or inadvertently unsubscribe from our email list, because you will not get the Zoom link without being on our email list. So I can resubscribe you if you inadvertently did that. But if you're not getting the Zoom link, it's because you unsubscribed, or you've got some blockers on your computer that are blocking our emails, because we do send at least 3 emails within the 24 hours before each program with the Zoom link. Now, please welcome my amazing partner, David Lehr, who will tell you about a couple more programs and who will introduce our speakers. David?
Thank you. Thank you, Janice. It's a pleasure to be here again. Before I introduce the program, I'd like to remind everyone about 2 of our upcoming broadcasts. On January 12th, we'll host a panel on the landmark Charlottesville decision, which was handed down last month. It is a precedent that has serious implications for how extremist groups can be counteracted. The lead counsel and initiator of the case, Roberta Kaplan, who's joined us before, will talk about the case, the status of extremist groups today, their vulnerabilities, and the efficacy of using litigation as a tool to fight bigotry and hate. Later in January, we'll be joined by Anne Applebaum, the Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist of The Atlantic, whose articles are almost always news-making events because of her incisive analysis. Her most recent book is entitled Twilight for Democracy: The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. She'll be with us on January 26th. Our guest tonight, Bill Kristol, has been described as the intellectual Brahmin of the modern conservative movement. His commentary has led him to be a regular on ABC's This Week, a columnist for the New York Times, a frequent presence on CNN and MSNBC, and to being the editor of The Bulwark, among numerous other achievements. And just for the record, Bill is even more pleasant, civil, and gracious than he appears on TV. We are deeply grateful for his willingness to join us tonight. He'll be interviewed by one of our most popular moderators, the Emmy Award-winning Madeleine Brand. Madeleine is an LA native who has anchored programs for national NPR and its affiliate stations around the country. She too accommodated to the abrupt change in guests without batting an eye, and she is a pleasure to work with, to watch, and to listen to. Madeleine?
Thank you so much, David, and thank you, Janice, and thank you for everyone for tuning in and not giving up on the program, even though we did a last minute switcheroo. And I'm really excited to talk to you, Bill, about, well, as Janice mentioned, the first anniversary is approaching, and it seems to have happened very quickly, this first anniversary. So lots in the news this week about the texts that Mark Meadows received and sent, the Fox News hosts that were implicated in all that, and were begging Mark Meadows to get his boss to call off the insurrectionists. I'm wondering, from your perspective, were you surprised to see these texts and surprised to see what these Fox News hosts were thinking in real time?
Well, first of all, it's good to be with you, Madeleine, and see you in person. Well, not quite in person, on Zoom, as opposed to just talking with you on NPR or on the radio. So it's nice to see you, and great to be back with Dave and Janice and all of you who are on. I mean, I've done this now a few times, and I would say that the kind of feedback you get, the number of emails I've gotten, people on Twitter from this program really is quite extraordinary. It's a very engaged group, I think, and intelligent group. And so it's really nice to be with you all again. And congratulations on 2 years of real success here in building this from scratch. 2021, you know, at the beginning of 2021, I was hopeful, and I still, of course, am hopeful at some level, but we're about to have a new president inaugurated. The incumbent president who'd been defeated had made efforts to, you know, interrupt the normal course of events of registering the votes and counting the votes and recording the votes, but it looked like he wasn't going anywhere. I was pretty alarmed. There were a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes in the Justice Department, the Defense Department, and attempts to pressure state legislators, but it looked like we might make it through and then get a real clean start and a chance for the Republican Party, the party I had been associated with for decades, to rethink things, to liberate itself, maybe more gradually than I would like, but at least gradually, from Donald Trump and from Trumpism. And, you know, it wasn't going to happen overnight. And there was a lot I still wouldn't like about the current Republican Party, but I was somewhat hopeful for our political situation. And I got to say, I'm not as hopeful today. I think the challenges are as great as they seemed at the beginning of the year, and in some ways greater, because, you know, January 6th was terrible. The immediate reaction to it was pretty good in the sense that we went ahead and counted the votes, and even Republicans denounced it. But a month, 2 months later, Republicans were backing away from denouncing it and justifying and rationalizing what Trump had done. And now, 10 or 11 months later, we're beyond that. You know, they're basically treating January 6th, and more importantly, maybe, well, not more importantly, but as importantly as what happened that day, what happened over those 2 or 3 months, November, December, January, they're treating that as kind of a dress rehearsal for what should be done in future elections, more than as a terrible event for which they should feel some responsibility, perhaps, for going along with Trump, but in any case should be repudiating and washing their hands of, and being very happy that that's in the rearview mirror. January 6, 2021 is not in the rearview mirror. For me, that's the key lesson of the year. That's why it's so important that the January 6th committee is doing its job. It's why Liz Cheney has spoken so eloquently about the importance of what they're doing. It's partly a matter of setting the record straight. That's always important, correcting lies about the past. But the lies about the past aren't just abstract lies about the past. You know, you might get something wrong about what happened in some policy area in 1985. And for the record, it's always good to correct those things, but it doesn't really change our policies or the world going forward. That's not true here. There's an agenda. The people who are whitewashing January 6th have an agenda going forward. And that's why it's so important to be clear about what happened. So I'm not that surprised by anything that's been learned, but I'm glad that they're bringing it out. I think the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, deserves credit for pushing ahead with this committee, not letting people like Jim Jordan on it, being open then to Liz Cheney when she approached her. I don't know who approached who exactly, but when they discussed her participation on it. And I think in that respect, we've ended up with a very strong committee that seems to be doing, I know a little bit of some of the people at the staff level and so forth. I mean, they're doing a very serious job. Whether it fundamentally changes American politics, whether tens of millions of voters change their mind because of what the committee finds, that's another question. But very important that they're doing what they're doing.
At least for history's sake, then, because it seems that at this point, it's almost impossible to convince Trump supporters that anything went wrong on January 6th.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, it's depressing how few seem willing to be convinced, but 2, 3, 4% isn't that many, but it's the margin of victory or defeat in elections, and it matters, and you never know. I think one thing about I'm as I said at the beginning, I'm kind of pessimistic in a sense, or it's been a year to induce a certain amount of pessimism that we're going to get out of this ditch that we or the country has dug itself into over the last several years. We're not going to get out of it as quickly and as easily as we hope. So I'm not blithely optimistic about it all. On the other hand, it is true that it's such an unusual phenomenon for America. I think the Trump presidency, the success of his demagoguery, the kind of cult of personality that he's inspired, the extent to which people are now willing to go and embracing lies and conspiracy theories, that's all bad. Maybe the upside of it is it can break faster than we think. Maybe the fever does break, to use that metaphor. Maybe it sort of can go away a little more quickly than one thinks. There are times in the past, I think of Joe McCarthy, extremely strong, not like Trump, wasn't an ex-president or president, but McCarthyism dominated the Republican Party and to some degree, and American politics to some degree. 50 to 40, not from 50 to about 53. The spell got broken in 54, and it was kind of over very fast after that. Now, I don't think that's going to be the case here, because we have an ex-president, we have a whole narrative that goes beyond the particular things Joe McCarthy was focused on. So I don't think we're simply going to pop this balloon and everything's going to get back to normal, so to speak. But you don't know kind of what will happen in different primaries, what will happen in different areas of the country, and just in different policy areas and so forth, that might lead to some change of view, at least on the part of some people. It's not the hardcore Trump supporters who have to be convinced; it's the accommodators. And let me say one word about that, because we've discussed that a little bit before on some of these shows, but I always come back to it, because I think the media is obsessed, understandably, with all those tens of millions of MAGA supporters and true believers and conspiracy theorists and all that. But look, it's a problem. But that they would not be as powerful as they are if there weren't a ton of elite enablers and rationalizers who are willing to not fight against the lies, not try to correct those people's misunderstanding, not try to persuade them to get vaccinated, for example, even though it's for their own good, and kind of go along with them, use their political clout to keep themselves in office, to advance their own political agendas, their own political careers, or if they're donors or columnists or whatever, to kind of float along on that tide rather than challenging it. I think without the elites, you would have kind of a problem, a kind of populist movement that would be damaging to the country, but limited in its damage. It's the elite enablers, whether they're senators or members of Congress or governors, but also, as I say, business types and intellectual types as well, who I think really have made this such a dangerous moment. I mean, another way of saying it is, if it was just Trump and a bunch of Trumpists, it would be one thing, but they now control one of our two major parties. They control major organs in the media, obviously. There are a ton of business types who think, well, we got to get along with these people. They may be back in power. They are in power in some states. They may control the House of Representatives in a year. We can't really take them on. So you've got an awful lot of people accommodating what's a very bad force, and that makes it even stronger.
So let's talk about the media arm of this, the Fox News part of it, because that is where a lot of the focus is this week with those texts. And, initially you did see the horror on the part of Laura Ingraham and the others. And initially they were condemning this. Many of the Trump supporters decided, well, if Fox is going to say this, then we're going to go to OAN or other even more right-wing news outlets, news in quotes outlets. And then Fox kind of realized, we should battle on this, because we're going to lose a bunch of our viewership. I suppose I'm wondering, if Fox hadn't done that, would we be in a much different position today? do you think? Do you think they have that much power that they could have tamped down this idea that the election was stolen, and really averted what is becoming increasingly looking like at least an unarmed civil war, but a war between two very different realities?
I mean, I think they could have made a difference. It's striking that even in those texts that were sent that afternoon, the tone is more, this is going to hurt us. You know, this is going to damage us going forward. You've got to stop this. This is going to hurt your legacy, you know, Mr. President. Not, this is a horrifying thing and you've got to stop it immediately for the sake of the country. But still, they did think it was going to damage them. I think they saw that the Trump himself was not going to reverse course, that Trump continued to have great personal clout, and that they ended up, what's the joke about leaders, you know, stop the parade. I need to run to get ahead of the parade of my followers, you know. I mean, there's a lot of that going on with a lot of these elected officials. Kevin McCarthy, terrible thing that's happened he says on January 7th. And then by literally 3 weeks later, I think it's literally exactly, he goes to Mar-a-Lago and bends the knee to Trump. And of course, there are many instances of that. There are people like McConnell who stayed stronger to some degree, but, you know, didn't vote to convict. And we could have had convicted him after impeaching him for what now is perfectly obvious from what we know were impeachable crimes that Trump committed before and on January 6th. And he would, accompanying impeachment and conviction, one can disqualify the person who's impeached and convicted from holding future office. And he wouldn't be, you know, a possible presidential candidate in 2024, which would have reduced his power a lot. And that's, what were there, 57 senators who voted to convict? So that's on the 10 Republican senators who know better. And, you know, some of whom were retiring, even they didn't need, but who just couldn't quite bring themselves to face the onslaught they would have faced if they had voted to convict. So Fox is part of that, but I think they're only part of the elite kind of backtracking and accommodation that's happened. But I mean, another way of looking at it, if you just want to do the kind of thought experiment, though, Madeleine, which is a good, you know, is a good one that you suggested, like, could have things have gone differently? I mean, think how amazing it is that Liz Cheney is all alone. I mean, she's got Adam Kinzinger. I mean, she went along with Trump. She and I were quite close 10 years ago, worked together on a bunch of things. And we drifted apart in 2017, 2018, because she was willing to not be an outspoken critic of Trump. She wasn't, to her credit, you know, a terrible promoter of it. She didn't promote the nativism and the xenophobia and so forth. But, you know, she went along with the legislative agenda. She didn't stand up much she didn't lead any charge against Trump. She voted against impeachment the first time on Ukraine. And she sort of nominally, I guess, supported him for re-election in 2020. And I think her view was that, you know, just someone like her who was in a leadership position could do good afterwards. She just had to kind of navigate these waters, not do anything too bad, disgraceful, obviously, not do anything like that, but just got to go along more than she wanted to, but then it would be over. She realized it wasn't over after November 3rd. She realized Trump wasn't going away. She realized that he was genuinely trying to overturn the election. I think she knew a lot about what was going on internally in parts of the administration, especially the Defense Department, because of her and her father's close connections with many people who've worked there in the past. And she was really alarmed. And she was, this former defense secretary sent that letter, remember, around January 3rd, before the insurrection, before the 6th, worrying about the military and about what the defense civilian leadership might do. So, I mean, there was a lot. She was very worried. And I think when January 6th happened, she thought, okay, this is the moment. I've got to lead the party or join in leading the party away from this. It's the moment of truth. And she, to her credit, she made that decision, and to her credit, she stuck to it. And she's continued down that path. She hasn't sort of backed. She could have kind of gone silent or just kind of, you know, said some good things, but not chosen to be on the committee, not chosen to give these very strong speeches that she's given, not chosen to help lead the investigations, as far as I can tell, genuinely digging into what happened. But she's, I think, genuinely believes it's important, and she's doing the right thing. But what's amazing, I think, if you step back, is like, why is she alone? Okay, I understand not 200 members of the House aren't going to be with her, but 80, 40, 20, a few Republican governors? I mean, is it that, you know, I mean, is she that far outside the mainstream? And the answer is yes. And that tells you so much.
Even this week, when the House voted to recommend that the Justice Department take up the contempt of Congress charge for Mark Meadows, only she and Kinzinger were the Republicans who voted to do that. Uh,
Right.
and I'm wondering, what about all of these Republicans who are in moderate districts? There are plenty here in Southern California. Well, not plenty, but several. What are they thinking? Are they thinking that this is what their constituents want? They're in suburban districts, which have gone both ways, at least here in Southern California recently.
So California has more. I mean, the first answer is that most Republicans, partly because of gerrymandering, and partly because of the socioeconomic sorting of the country, kind of, are not so much a swing district. So, for 150, let's say, of the 210 or so in the House, their constituents, they think, are fine with them being either pro-Trump or at least not taking on Trump and Trumpism or the big lie, just kind of keeping quiet about it. I agree that California, partly because of the results in 2020, happens to have, partly maybe because of the top two system of voting and partly for other reasons, seems to have more Republicans who are in swingish suburban districts where being too closely associated with Trump and Trumpism and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz, all these people might do some damage. I think those people are, some of them are not saying terrible things. They I think if pushed would say Joe Biden won the election. Probably they're not. On the other, they're not going around correcting everything that they could be correcting. Probably the same on the vaccine, right? They're probably saying no, people should take it and get the boosters. But of course, it's the right of conscience. We don't want to, no one should be, forced to do anything or stay. And public health's made a lot of mistakes, and I'm sure they're trying to navigate it and stay alive. And I think what they think politically is that it could be a pretty good year for Republicans. 2022 off-year elections are usually referenda on the incumbent White House, not on the White House from 2 years ago. Voters can justify to themselves. I wouldn't make this argument, but you can see why a sensible voter would say, look, I'm not voting for Trump. I'm just voting for this new member of Congress who seems pretty impressive. And I kind of would prefer a Republican to check some of the Biden big spending stuff. And it's only the House. They're not going to be able to do anything. I mean, Biden's president for the next 2 years. So I think that's what they think voters will think. And they may be right that that's what these swing voters will think. And so the same voters who put them in office in 2020 will stick with them for another term. The Democrats aren't doing so great, right? So it's not like there's a huge momentum to throw them out. And maybe in a couple of other districts, they'll to be able to tip over some close seats. So I think that's their thinking. It's not the most noble thinking in the world, and maybe it won't work, but it's not, from their point of view, they're trying to sort of, stay alive and kind of stay afloat, to use them, and not buck the big tides, not encourage it either. And I'm sure they would say privately, look, in 2024, we can make a difference and get a more responsible candidate, perhaps. And, what's the point of just isolating yourself the way Cheney and Kinzinger have, or the way others who've left the House have? I think that misunderstands the degree to which going along with this strengthens it, really. That if people who are prominent don't stand up against it, how are voters supposed to know that it's a big lie? If their own member of Congress doesn't tell them it's a big lie, their own senators, not in California, but in other states, don't tell them it's a big lie, how are they supposed to figure this out by themselves? But I mean, maybe they should, but it's easier if more leaders speak up. So I don't agree with that kind of thinking that they're engaged in, but I can see how they get there.
But they also might be afraid of being primaried and afraid.
Yeah, no, and then there's a practical issue. Yeah, it's the people who vote in a primary, right? The same as the general election. I mean, California's top two thing may handle that a little better, incidentally, though, I would say. I mean, that in a way they have to be a little less worried, maybe, about a primary, maybe not. It's a little hard to know how those dynamics work. So
there is a move underway in some Republican-controlled states to have the legislature appoint electors for the next presidential election. And they are calling this the Independent State Legislature Doctrine. And they're citing Article 2 of the Constitution. So in states such as Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, this move is being considered or put into practice. Voters might choose Biden or whoever else is on the ticket. We can talk about that later. And the legislature might say, well, there were some irregularities. We need to appoint our own our other slate of electors, and choose Trump or whoever else is running. This is what Rudy Giuliani tried to do unsuccessfully last year. And so now that this seems to be more of a concerted strategy, how worried are you that this could be successful in 2024?
No, I'm pretty worried. I mean, again, these things that seem just like outlandish, kind of kooky interpretations of the Constitution that had never been really advanced in a very serious way, certainly not in modern times. And maybe like one elector would occasionally, these rogue electors who would differ from the state slate, or, some state legislator somewhere would say, I don't care if they may have miscounted. We need to send a different slate. I mean, it never got taken seriously. And suddenly now it's not quite mainstream doctrine, I'd say, but it's dangerously close to it in some of the key swing states. And lots of people are running in Republican primaries in 2022 for Secretary of State, for governor, for other statewide constitutional offices, and for the state legislature, and for boards of elections and so forth, articulating versions of this doctrine. And that's that is worrisome. Maybe not the doctrine itself, but the fact that there's a huge political movement behind this and other doctrines, or using this and other doctrines is a better way of saying it. Someone put it well to me today. There was that article a couple days ago in the New York Times that had a pretty good account of what's happening across the country, especially in the swing states, down to the level of these local electoral offices, which aren't even really offices, sort of half volunteer things, but some of them have nominal elections, or you get appointed by the commissioner or the county commissioner. And customarily, it was pretty nonpartisan and kind of things people volunteered for. And now suddenly, there's a concerted effort by Trump supporters to stack these so they can perhaps say, no, we've got irregularities here in this county and Encino, and we think the Encino vote just can't be counted. So suddenly a whole bunch of votes go out the window, and then some state legislature, this won't happen in California presumably, but a state legislature says, well, I guess we'll just not count Encino because it seems like it's so irregular. So the rest of the state adds up to this. I mean, that's a version of what they were trying at the national level, right, on January 6th. Some states were too confusing, so we're just going to throw them out. And guess what? The ones they throw out were all ones that Biden won. So, but having a whole political movement behind us is what's scary, more than the doctrine, right? And as someone said to me, this we were talking about today, said, what's worrisome is there's a lot of energy on the, let's call it the anti-democratic side. They're running for all these offices. They're organizing. They're in touch with each other. They have podcasts, and Steve Bannon's encouraging them. But they've got money. They've got meetings. They've got organizations pushing some of this stuff. They're networking people together. The pro-democracy side isn't really organized in that way. Now, it's understandable. I mean, it never really occurred to anyone that one had to get organized in this way. And the pro-democracy side is busy having normal politics with Democrats and Republicans running for these different positions, but I mean, there needs to be much more of a concerted effort, in my opinion, to fight against the anti-democratic effort to corrupt the electoral process going forward.
But this seems to be a lesson that the Democrats keep not learning over the many, many years, and not only in this issue, but on all sorts of other issues. I'm thinking of abortion as a prime example. The pro-life side has been working for decades on the local level, getting these local laws changed, and you see the fruits of that in Texas right now. Whereas the pro-choice side has not focused on that. We saw it in redistricting, in that battle, that the Republican side has been focused very diligently on the local battle to create legislative districts, electoral districts, political districts that would favor them in the long run. And the Democrats have not seen that. Why aren't they learning their lesson and seeing what's happening now and doing something about it?
Well, in some places they are doing something, and to be fair, in some places they did things earlier. I mean, Georgia, Stacey Abrams, what she did was awfully impressive, and in fact probably led to the Democrats winning those 2 seats on January 5th. That was also a year ago, and therefore controlling the Senate, or having a 50-50 Senate, which they control because of Vice President Harris. So, but I agree, in general, there hasn't been that kind of mobilization and organization on the left. I mean, so I think a couple of reasons. I mean, the Democratic Party is its own story, and as someone who's now much friendlier to it than I was 10, 20 years ago, I must say, seeing it up close, they're nice people, and I actually am much more sympathetic with them on most issues than I used to be, but it's not the most organized and purposeful group in the world, and they do sort of seem to enjoy fighting each other more than actually, passing legislation or fighting Republicans or whatever. So that's a bit of a problem. But I don't know. It's an interesting question on the progressive side. Generally, there's been a certain amount of complacency, I think, some of that is because progressives were winning a lot of these social and cultural issues. I mean, same-sex marriage or whatever. They did really organize, and there were huge fights, and they lost some ballot initiatives, as you all know, in California, but they also won some. And they worked the courts hard, and they worked the legal system, and they worked the opinion leaders, and eventually things changed. And I think everyone kind of assumed after that, 2015, that, well, yeah, that one had been a win. Other things were pretty well settled, Roe v. Wade. And, you know, there wasn't the need for the kind of organization, perhaps. And then Trump happened in 2016, huge surprise, some mobilization. But a friend of mine put this, actually another person I was talking to today, we were talking about this exact question, which is a very, I think, interesting one. And she made a good point, which is there was that women's march right after Trump, it was the day before or day after inauguration, I can't remember, that weekend. And that was a pretty impressive thing. And that was really kind of grassroots and bottom up, and hundreds of thousands, 750,000 people, something like that. And then other efforts at the low, not everyone could come to Washington. But I don't feel like that didn't lead to led to some organizational efforts locally and stuff, but it didn't lead to a big continued mobilization and effort. Right? It would be nice if the Women's March had stayed alive, hadn't fractured over a million different issues, a million fights over issues that are not really central to the Women's March, like Israel and Palestine and other things. And if they were organized today to fight a lot of local school board elections, right? But they're not really. And I do think some of it, I think, is sort of an organizational failure. Some of it is a kind of overconfidence. If you're a progressive, you tend to think that progress is going in your direction. And if you just kind of, beat back the worst elements, things are going to be okay. And who would have thought that in 2021, we're going to have, kind of school boards being stormed almost, or harangued by people objecting to very famous stories and novels and biographies of very important Americans being
Toni
taught
Morrison,
in schools.
for example. Yeah.
I mean, you just wouldn't think it's happening. And part of it is also that progressives live in states where this isn't happening much. So I don't know that you have a huge problem in California, in most of California, or most of the progressive parts of California where this is happening. So if you're comfortable with your schools in your area and comfortable with the laws on reproductive rights and other such things, you're fine, right? I mean, I'm not saying this in some kind of negative way. I mean, you are okay, and you've done your job locally, and you can't control what happens in Texas or Mississippi to some degree. So I think some of it is the sorting out of the country, which leads people in New York and California and Chicago to think, we've done our bit here, but the degree to which bad thing, it is one country, so that if stuff starts to happen elsewhere, it spills over, and it's not healthy for the country anyway to have these kind of cultural wars going on. But also, it's not as if these effects can entirely be controlled into so limited to 1 or 2 places. And if it's unjust, it's unjust, whether it's in 30 places or 300 places.
Right, but I think the Virginia governor's race was seen as a big wake-up call, right? I mean, they didn't think they were going to lose that one.
Yeah, and I live here in Virginia, and I was disappointed by the result because I think McAuliffe was a good governor and would have been again. I think Youngkin, to his credit, moderated enough to reassure my neighbors here in Northern Virginia that he wasn't like Trump, and he was going to be a standard Republican, pro-business kind of governor. We've had pretty moderate Republican governors here, mostly, really, and so that's why the state's pretty well governed. It's had pretty moderate Democrats and pretty moderate Republicans, truthfully, and not that much partisanship until about 6-8 years ago. Actually, the state legislature is pretty often pretty closely balanced, actually. And so I think there's a kind of complacency here, a sense here that, well, we can vote for Youngkin, it doesn't mean we're pro-Trump. I mean, now look, it is a governor's race. It's not a federal race. It's not a Senate or House race in an off year. Hard to know how much that will translate. I do think one thing that could happen in 2022 that will change the dynamics is the Republican primaries. I mean, voters in a lot of states, and a lot of states that are not deep red states, Pennsylvania, even Ohio, North Carolina, other places, see these primaries and see that maybe there's one sort of old-fashioned Republican who's just kind of a standard Republican, but then there's a bunch of these Trump people competing to out-Trump each other, so to speak. I wonder what the reaction of voters will be there. It's one thing to sort of say in a poll, I don't quite approve of Biden, or I prefer to have a Republican Congress to check Biden even. It's another thing to see Josh Mandel in Ohio and think, yeah, I really want him as my senator, given the way he's been behaving. And so I wonder if there will be a pushback to that. Now, historically, what matters more is the party that's in power in the White House and how people think they're doing, and fairly or unfairly. And I think it's a combination of both. I would say there's people have slid to a somewhat negative view of Biden, not terribly negative, but he's lost several points, and that will make it harder to hold the House, maybe the Senate. But I do wonder if the radicalism of the Republican Party, and to some degree the radicalism of conservatism across the board, I mean, if Roe v. Wade doesn't simply get restricted somewhat, but overturned or virtually overturned, and suddenly that's a fight in state legislatures across the country. I mean, you mentioned Texas. Heck of a lot of people in the suburbs of Houston and Dallas and in Austin and in El Paso are not in favor of an abortion law like Texas is. They may not be as liberal on some of these issues as some people in California, and they may want something in between, and they may be comfortable with a much more strict limitation on third-term abortions. I mean, there are many, many ways one could imagine legislation being written that would have different sort of shades, right? But I don't know that Texas is full of people who think that, you know, it should be illegal, period, including in cases of rape and incest, and or the time limit should be so short that you can't even really know if the baby's been conceived. I mean, the whole thing is I wonder if they've overplayed their hand somewhat. But to get to your point, you still would need a Democratic Party that's able to fight effectively, and that means both fighting and being tough and being smart, and also not making unforced mistakes, which give Republicans and conservatives, sometimes undemagogically and unfairly, an ability to beat up the Democrats for being, I don't know, soft, defunding the police or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Which the Republicans are good at that, and Fox is good at that, and the Democrats are not very good in reverse, I would say, at taking advantage of Republican mistakes. I mean, I've been so struck just watching. We do a lot at our group, Republican Accountability Project, Defending Democracy Together, trying to highlight just what Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz and all these people say. I mean, these are people in good standing in the Republican conference and House of Representatives, and they now want to throw Liz Cheney out of the Republican conference. And they're crazy and also mean-spirited and terrible in so many ways. But I don't know, the Democratic Party doesn't ever seem to make it. They occasionally say maybe we should kick Lauren Boebert off some committees, but they don't have it's not a theme of theirs really, that the Republican Party is deeply extremist and mean-spirited and incapable of governing. I would say they're not. They sometimes attack Trump, which is fine, but they don't really make that case about the Kevin McCarthy-led House Republican Conference. And if you don't make the case about the House Republican Conference, then in any individual House race, people aren't going to quite say, well, gee, it's scary. I shouldn't vote for that person because that means those Republicans will run it again. But the Democrats haven't done a very good job of tying that together, I don't think.
Yeah, and there are some Democrats who are really alarmed, such as the Michigan Secretary of State, who says this is a 5-alarm fire, and the Democratic leadership in this country is not taking it as seriously as it should, and has gotten caught up in various arguments, internecine, as you have alluded to or said, on voting rights bills. HR 1, for example, was loaded with all sorts of other things in it that really couldn't pass the Senate, much less be law. And now the John Lewis Voting Rights Act is also dead. So there seems to be a lack of a coherent strategy on the part of the Democrats in terms of addressing this one particular issue that a lot of Democrats on the ground in these battleground states, such as Michigan, are really worried about.
Yeah, no, I've been pretty involved in the voting rights stuff. And I think, to be fair, they're on the right side, and I think they're trying to do the right thing. So we shouldn't blame them most. We should blame the Republicans, who are united, all 50, against not just HR 1, which did have some extraneous stuff in it that I didn't like much either, traditional liberal proposals. Some of them are okay, some of them foolish, I think. But they kind of did whittle it down with Manchin to make it a much more core kind of pro-voting rights act, and then the John Lewis Act, which has its own particular importance, obviously, for protecting minority voters, basically. That got one Republican vote, Lisa Murkowski. Again, I think the Democrats could have done more to highlight that, honestly, and to put pressure on Republicans in both bodies now for voting against that. But again, they sort of have the vote, and then it kind of happens, and then it's a one-day story, and you're in the news business, you know that works, and then they move on to 18 other things, or above all, I guess, to infrastructure and building back better, and somehow they forgot the voting stuff, and it hasn't been a sustained rhetorical effort. I also think the Electoral Count Act, which has not been introduced even yet, which would fix the core situation that we saw, from November 3rd to January 6th a year ago, which is to say, we have a very ramshackle system left over from 1887, basically, which has worked okay because people have acted in good faith. So no one's bothered to try to do the stuff that Trump tried, And so it doesn't matter that much that it's pretty little confusing about exactly, how the electors get elected and what the role of the vice president is. It's not that confusing. He's just supposed to record the votes. But these are kind of guardrails, which, how should I put it, that were constructed in good faith. They haven't been reinforced in 140 years. Some of them are kind of like outdated and obsolete, and it'll be like in a highway, right? No one's on any upkeep. So that can be fixed, and that's really should be nonpartisan. That's really just like updating the system, and making sure that the votes get accurately transmitted and that people don't muck around with them, and that the vice president reads the votes he's given, and so forth. That the governor transmits the votes, and that hasn't been introduced. Now, the Democrats have a complicated reason for that, which is I understand what they're saying. This one should be bipartisan. They don't want to confuse it with the other two. I think they missed a huge opportunity, though, but I think they may still introduce it and try to merge them all together, the best parts of all of them, and say, look, here's one bill that make sure elections here work well, that we have free and fair elections. And let's all get behind that and change the filibuster for that. But as it is, they sort of want to change the filibuster for these first two bills. The third bill doesn't exist yet. And meanwhile, they're fighting, on Building Back Better, which Biden spent much more time on than on voting rights. Building Back Better, which is the centerpiece of their legislative agenda, apparently is itself a kind of a confusing piece of legislation and not very clear exactly what it does. And this one I kind of got interested in, just putting my old kind of Kennedy School public policy hat on and trying to look into how do some of these things work? I mean, pre-K, universal pre-K, this kind of thing liberals have been for quite a while, and it sounds great. There are kids who need that, kids especially from disadvantaged homes whose parents don't have the time or the ability to, frankly, get them off to a good start in their education, particularly, and or they're two working parents. It's hard, and it'd be great if they could go to the school and have a good pre-K experience at age 3 instead of waiting till 4 or 5. But again, I mean, is it all going to be public schools, or is it going to use current childcare providers? How's the money get transferred? There are a lot of issues, right? Some corporations already pay for aspects of childcare, others don't. Do the corporations that pay get reimbursed now when they, and it's all the normal public policy things that if you go to take a course in political science or go to a grad school in public policy, you study. Turns out these things are not well worked out. I mean, they really did kind of put together kind of things that have been lying around for a while and say, okay, we all want to do this. And I guess they kind of thought it sounds good, so it will all get passed. But I would say, to be fair to mention some of these people, some of the critics are being disingenuous, but some of the people are actually looking at it and thinking, I'm not so sure some of this is so great. Now, I think child tax credit, checks to people to help them out, that's an easier thing to explain. Medicare benefits, easy to explain. We already have Medicare. We have a lot of things paid for. Some things aren't paid for. Vision, hearing. Let's pay for the things that aren't paid for. That's more standard public policy, but that's not what they've emphasized. Insulin, some of the drug costs, that's a pretty good issue, frankly, and I think it's a fair one. There should be caps on the amount that families have to pay for drugs they genuinely need for life-saving purposes, and that's a pretty easy thing to explain to people. It's a little expensive, but it's a good thing to spend government money on, probably. Maybe you means test it. But again, that's gotten lost in all the talk about a million other things. So they haven't done a very good job, I think, of prioritizing and making their case.
And selling it and the PR part of it. I mean, you can say all you want about Trump. He was very good at being in front of people and telling people what he wanted to do, or just being a presence. There are days when I don't even think of Joe Biden.
He's good normally, in a way. I mean, I think it's an interesting point. We've done, my colleague Sarah Longwell's done a lot of focus groups, and many people said exactly what you just said. And, I think at the beginning, they would have said that's kind of a relief. And I think they still feel that somewhat. They don't want Trump screaming and yelling every day again, but they do need more sense of a visible leadership than they're getting. I was myself a little slow on this. I didn't kind of think that was a big problem. So I thought, okay, we want normalcy. But I mean, another way of putting it is, the reason you elect a president, it can be a very important and legitimate reason, isn't necessarily what you want from the president a year in. You know what I mean? You elect Biden, so it wouldn't be Trump, basically. We get rid of the craziness, the insanity, the mean-spiritedness, the divisiveness. That doesn't mean that a year in, you also don't want some actual leadership, some priorities, seeing the president make the case. Also, it's not just the president, though. You're going to have Governor Whitmer on here, and I hope I'm sure you'll have her on again soon. There are a lot of pretty able Democrats around the country. There are governors, there are senators, there are cabinet members, and really you don't hear much from any of them, do you? I mean, you covered this stuff for a while. I mean, it used to be that if there were major issues, you'd have major figures in the cabinet speaking for them, or sometimes White House types, or sometimes surrogates who were in the private sector or something in the not-for-profit sector. I've been struck on this. I mean, here's the pandemic, which is kind of important, which I think the Biden administration has done a pretty good job. A couple of things I would criticize them on, but who's the spokesman on the pandemic? Who's the person who gives you the authoritative, this is government
Fauci,
policy,
right?
Fauci still, I mean, which is fine, but he'd been through the wars, so to speak, under Trump. And I think he would be the first to say that he's not necessary. I mean, I respect him tremendously, don't get me wrong, but I'm not sure he's the best day-to-day person. And, there are many other people who could. Michelle Walensky, the head of CDC, is very capable. She's occasionally on TV a little bit, but it's confusing. She's CDC, there's FDA, they each have all their own advisory committees. That's fine. If that's the way the bureaucracy works, it's the way it works. You don't have to change it all. But there should be much more, I think, of a visible, authoritative spokesperson on some of these issues who can say, okay, you know what? We've just gotten some new studies and the boosters really matter. And this Omicron thing is somewhat dangerous. It may be a little, not quite as severe as some of the other variants, but it's going to spread very fast. You're much, much better off with the boosters. And half of Americans over 65 who've gotten vaccinated haven't gotten boosted. And your chances of getting ill, thank God, not probably too severely ill, but still, some people will get ill and they'll have other conditions which will make it worse. Your chances are much worse if you haven't gotten a booster. Get boosted. I mean, they should be screaming that. Right?
Well, there was all that dissent, right? With this Walensky saying one thing.
Yeah, I mean,
and
I feel like that really is an unfortunate, that's kind of important. And they just haven't sort of grasped somehow. Biden's a senator. Senators don't have that kind of belief. Trump did have that sense of what executive power means, kind of, you got to make it simple, but you also have to give people a clear message. It was a bad message often. It was a very dumbed down message. And some of these messages don't have to be super complicated, and they really can be important. And that's one right now. And then on testing, I think we've also really messed that up, not having the kind of instant, rapid instant tests that are cheap, that are available in Europe, for example, which would make it much easier for schools to test kids, and if they're fine, stay in school instead of 10-day long quarantines and all kinds of things, right? But again, that one I've gotten in arguments personally with senior people in the Biden administration on. And they tell me, well, the FDA hasn't authorized these rapid tests. That's the antigen tests, the ones you just administer yourself 10 minutes. They're not medically, diagnostically reliable enough to be authorized by the FDA. Well, obviously, if you go to a doctor and feel sick, they're going to give you the PCR test, and they can give you 10 other tests, incidentally, you know what I mean? A blood test. And they're not going to stick something in your nose for 6 seconds and put it in a little tube for 10 minutes and say it's fine or not. But if you're worried about being contagious, and the odds are your 8-year-old's fine, but he was at a table last week where there was one kid whose parent got COVID. You just want to make sure, give him the test. It's perfectly reliable, as reliable as anything else is in terms of contagion. And those should be, that would reassure, I just think, lots of Americans that we sort of have this under control.
They should be free or very low cost.
Totally. And then the Biden administration's idea, they got a lot of pressure. So then they said, okay, we're going to make sure the insurance companies reimburse you for that. I mean, those tests you literally buy at Walmart or CVS. I mean, what are you going to send?
And if you don't have insurance, you don't.
Well, also, what are you going to send the insurance company? Your little coupon? No, it's not a coupon. I mean, it's like a literal.
That long receipt you get.
Yeah, that long receipt you get from CVS. I'm sure they'll be very happy to get that at Aetna. And then there'll be 16 things on it, and they'll sort out the one that is for, and how many tests you get to buy. I mean, it's crazy to do it that way. No other country in the world does it that way. And somehow they talk themselves into it because they didn't want to be too hard to buy it. I don't know. They've sort of made some mistakes like that I think have eroded people's confidence, not in their ideas really, but just in the kind of execution of the government.
Okay, let me get to some of these questions before we run out of time. Shell asks, do you think an independent party might emerge from what's left of the Republican Party?
So I think there's a greater chance than there has been for really, my adult lifetime. We could have an independent candidate or third party or both in the near future. I'm not so sure about the next couple of years, but They're clearly, you can imagine the Democratic Party going pretty far left, a Trumpy Republican Party, and an awful lot of Americans wanting a kind of centrist type governance. And that flares up occasionally at the state level. I mean, Schwarzenegger was kind of a version of that, right? But there are a lot of reasons why that doesn't happen at the national level, in terms of the electoral system and US history and stuff, and the strength of the two parties. So I think I think something like that's possible, or maybe more likely would be alliances between centrists in both parties, which right now everything's going in the other direction, but I think it's gone so far in the other direction that it is out of sync with where a lot of the voters are that I kind of think it's possible we'll have a big snapback, but that'll need some aggressive leadership from the center. But I think
who is emerging as
Cheney's awfully conservative, but it is interesting when you look at that committee, right? Just think of the image, Betty Thompson and Liz Cheney and Pelosi appointed them all, obviously. And you think, that's sort of kind of how government maybe should work, right? A liberal Democrat from Mississippi and a conservative Republican from Wyoming pursuing the truth together. And I kind of wonder whether that could have some ripple effects.
But do you see anyone emerging as an alternative in the Republican Party in the center to be a national figure like Trump?
Well, I mean, Cheney, I suppose, would be the most obvious. And she's conservative, but she would certainly be centrist in the sense of rule of law and all that, and a more traditional conservative, obviously. And so, I mean, right now, should we get clobbered in a national primary by Trump? She may lose her Wyoming primary to a Trump supporter. But, things could change there. And then there are a lot of other gradations, I would say, in the Republican world. For now, that's one I've been telling my Republican and former Republican friends that I think the best hope is to, work with moderates in the Democratic Party to govern well. But maybe at some point you could imagine a center reviving in the Republican Party.
Okay, Bob asks, who would make a good Democratic candidate should Biden not seek re-election?
I don't know. I mean, these things are very hard to predict, and I've been in Washington quite a while, and I'd say people's conventional wisdom has often been wrong about who would be the best candidates and who wouldn't be. I'd say what about Vice President Harris? Vice presidents have a rough time, usually in their second term, when they're the ones who are going to be running for president. But of course, a lot of people think Biden won't run for re-election. So Harris's first term is already sort of her second term, which means she's under much more of a spotlight than a typical first-term vice president, who, no one really cares what the vice president does in the first couple of years. That person's presumably learning the ropes. The president's busy governing. Cabinet secretaries are being cabinet secretaries. So she's under much more pressure than normal. She's probably made some mistakes. So if Biden doesn't run, I don't think it's by any means foreordained that Harris gets the nomination. I think other people will run. There'll be a lot of talk about other people, and there could be a mood for a fresh face. I'm not sure who that is. I mean, there are people, plenty of capable, younger members of Congress and governors and ex-governors. And I really think it's more, I guess my only instinct is that it's much more wide open than people now think. That, I mean, if Biden doesn't run, it would be so unusual for a president to limit himself to one term, for one thing, that a lot of voters are just going to say, who knows, maybe we just need a whole new person who's never been in Washington, Washington or governor, or maybe a private sector person. Or I think it could be pretty more wide open than people think.
Do you think he should run or not? Do you think he should be one term or?
I would have said 6-8 months ago that it's probably safer for him to run, and if he's up to it, and I think he won in 2020, and he kind of was good at holding the party together for all the little fights that go on. But I'm honestly just less certain now. I mean, I do feel like, he's doing fine. I think he's healthy and all that stuff. But I mean, running for re-election at age 82, I mean, that means you're president until you're 86. I don't know. That's pushing it, I think.
He has said he will run.
Well, you have to say that, though, to keep your leverage, I'd say. I mean, I think he wants to, but I just don't know what he'll feel like a couple of years from now and what the party will feel like. And I really think he's a patriotic person, and I think he'll try to do what's right for the country. I mean, I think if he thinks he could win and maybe others couldn't, I think he'd be very tempted to run again, even if he's getting a little older. But if he thinks that others would have as good a chance or a better chance as he does, I think he might choose not to run.
Part of the problem is inflation weighing down his poll numbers. So Mark asks, what can he do about inflation?
I mean, that's tough. And many people who get very well paid to be economists for major banks and financial institutions can debate this. It's a tough thing to bring down once it's started. We don't know how temporary it is and how permanent. I mean, I think he could explain it a lot better. Two things he could do. He could acknowledge it. And this, they were very slow on it. I saw this in Virginia. It hurt McAuliffe badly that the Biden people just seemed to be out of touch on it. They were sort of had all these fancy excuses for why it was transitory. People, meanwhile, were going to the supermarket, and honestly, if you're upper middle class, you probably don't look at the receipt that you get from CVS too much in each from Safeway at each particular item. You just, okay, fine, this is my grocery bill. But if you're on a fixed budget, you look at these things, and suddenly it's real, right? You just can't buy what you could buy in the past for your $80 or $150 or whatever the size of your family is, grocery bill, and people do not like being told that they don't understand, they're wrong about their own finances. They're not foolish. They know how much they're spending, and they know they're not being extravagant, and they know that something went up 10%. Now, so I think the better, if you look like you understand what's happening, that you appreciate, you care about what's happening. And secondly, I think he could explain that, look, we went through this pandemic that was kind of unprecedented, and the whole world economy got thrown into disarray. And it's going to take a while to sort out, and we're going to have supply chain problems and labor shortages. Some of the labor shortage stuff is good. The incomes are going up for lower income workers. That's not bad in a way. That's good. But it also does disrupt things because, for obvious reasons, it causes some price hikes. And I think he could reassure people that he's aware of what's going on. They're working on it. Again, I very much respect Janet Yellen, Secretary of the Treasury, but she's not really a visible presence out there explaining what's happening, reassuring people what's happening, and nor are there others. Larry Summers is probably the best known Democratic economist in the country right now, and he's not in the administration, and he's critical of it in some ways. So again, I don't know how much ultimately you can affect something like this in the short term. I think you can have sound policies over the medium term, but I think they could look more as if they just haven't been caught by surprise by it or denying it.
Mm. Okay. I think we're almost running out of time, but I'll ask one more. Here's a good closer question.
Okay.
Ed asks, what keeps you up at night and what gives you reason for optimism?
I'd say two things probably keep me up at night. I mean, one is the democracy question that we've discussed, and the Republican Party, which is a subset of that. The other is actually, we haven't talked about, is foreign policy, where I just think we do have a lot of threats. They're built up under both parties, to be honest, under Obama and Trump in some ways. But if you look at Putin and the border of Ukraine, if you look at Xi and China tightening his hold in a very dramatic way, in a very dangerous way, at least over the medium term, but maybe even the short term, Iran's nuclear program. I mean, there's a lot to worry about. Even if we had a normal Republican Party and it was kind of the 1990s or something, we'd be talking about these issues and saying, boy, it's a pretty challenging time. So, and I think those are so unpredictable. It's hard to know, but I am more worried about foreign policy than I was maybe at the beginning of a few months ago. Optimism, well, I think the country, remains a great country, and a lot of the public are sensible, and we have a lot of reservoirs of innovation and talent. I'm struck by that. The vaccine's a pretty amazing accomplishment, and I again wish the vaccine, though, I wish people would make more of a positive case for what made the vaccine possible. Globalization, economic interchange among different economies, right? The vaccine was sort of invented, I'll simplify a little bit, but in Germany by Turkish immigrants, by a little company there, a startup which had VC money behind it, but then distributed by massive, big pharma, Pfizer and so forth here. So for all the criticisms one can make of each of these aspects of modern capitalism and all, it's kind of amazing what they did. And it should make people a little more confident in defending the aspects of modern capitalism and globalization and free trade and the free movement of capital and all these things that have become unfashionable in the Trump Republican Party and somewhat unfashionable on the progressive left. Immigration, incidentally, if you want to increase labor supply, you know how we can do that very easily? Let in a lot of immigrants who want to work here. There are a ton of them. And they've been shut down for the last 3 or 4 years, partly by Trump, partly by the pandemic. We could let them in from all over the place and do appropriate ways, obviously. And that, I think, is, again, but Biden's worried, understandably worried about the politics of it. But it's a little shocking, I'll say this as someone who's pretty liberal on immigration. We're a year into the Biden administration. We basically he has not changed immigration policies at all. basically. And legal, or not, I'm just talking about the border. I mean, all kinds of policies, and even on the Afghans, which you can debate the decision, but now we have real obligations to people there. We're not doing as much as we should be doing to help more of them get out and stuff. So I think that would also help in terms of, as I say, of inflation and others, and the labor shortage. But it's more important. There are more important reasons than that for being for more liberal immigration. So again, I think there's a kind of paralysis that's making us stop short of being as successful as we could be in dealing with these problems.
Where's the optimism part? Did I miss?
Oh, yeah, where was the after? Well, if we let it, honestly, look at the immigrant thing. It's so interesting because everyone still wants to come here. They want to mostly work hard. They want to come here because we have an innovative economy and because you could do well. And fine, we should tax the wealthy a little more probably and worry about inequalities and stuff. But the extent to which this remains the center of opportunity, innovation is really extraordinary. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily predicted that, honestly, 10, 20 years ago. I thought, well, that's the rest of the world's going to catch up. We're getting kind of sclerotic. But I see what's happening in some areas. And I think even the adjustments during the pandemic were pretty amazing. After the initial shock and everyone huddling down. So the number of businesses that were able to survive by adapting their business model, the number of what we're doing here on Zoom. I mean, these things don't automatically happen. If a country is sort of unable to, doesn't have a lot of people in it who are pretty smart about how to deal with the circumstances they're facing. So I think the reaction to the pandemic has been a mixed bag, obviously, but that too, there have been some impressive aspects to that.
I could talk to you for a whole other hour. That hour just flew by, but so thank you for coming on and I don't want to call you a pinch hitter, but
that's okay. There were some good players who were pinch hitters, right? It's occasionally. Thank you, Madeleine. I really enjoyed it.
No, I really enjoyed it. Thanks for coming on and thanks for listening and watching. And next week's program examines generational change in politics, society, and our future, featuring 3 experts on young people, their views, and their aspirations. So definitely tune in for that. Thank you so much for tuning in for this one. Have a great rest of your night, and I'll see you next time.